Stephen Sondheim once said that what keeps theater alive is reinterpretation. And if you take even a surface level look at the world of theater, this becomes pretty clear. It's a world of constant reviving and recycling. Let's just take a look at the current state of Broadway today. Of the 30-something shows that graced Broadway over the course of 2025, 18 of them were adaptations, meaning based on a book, movie, TV show, historical source, or some other non-theatrical source. 7 were revivals, and only 7 were original works, meaning adaptations and revivals, or reinterpretations, if you will, made up about 78% of this year's Broadway season. So, if reinterpretation is the engine driving Broadway today, this begs the question, what does a successful reinterpretation even look like? Because they're definitely not all created equal. To see what a good interpretation looks like in practice, we can zoom in on one specific case, Disney's Newsies, a show that didn't simply adapt a movie, but rethought it from the ground up. So, Newsies. Newsies has basically become a household reference, at least for people that are somewhat tuned into the theater world. Most people could probably recognize Seize the Day, Santa Fe, or King of New York, or at least one of the very many iconic internet or pop culture moments that have emerged from the show. I mean, and obviously, who doesn't love Christian Bale? Wait, you guys didn't know Christian Bale was in Newsies? Who were you guys thinking? Oh, Jeremy Jordan. Okay. Most, however, only recognize the stage version, which premiered on Broadway in 2012, and not the original 1992 film. And that's because, to put it bluntly, the movie flopped. It grossed around $2,800,000 domestically and failed to recoup its $15 million budget, and it ranks among the lowest grossing live-action films produced by Walt Disney Studios. The stage show, on the other hand, was a massive success. It premiered at the Paper Mill Playhouse in 2011 and made its Broadway debut in 2012, where it played for more than 1,000 performances at the Nederlander Theater before switching to a touring production. It won the Tony Awards for Best Choreography and Best Original Score in 2012, and it is widely produced in regional theaters and schools across the United States. Film didn't. And how did reinterpretation transform a commercial failure into a theatrical success? Well, according to adaptation scholar Linda Hutcheon, in A Theory of Adaptation, fidelity to the original text shouldn't be the primary measure of success. To adapt, she writes, is to adjust, to alter, and to make suitable. Adaptation is an acknowledged transposition of recognizable work, a creative and interpretive act of appropriation, a deviation that is not derivative. In other words, success in adaptation should be measured by suitability to medium, not fidelity to source. And this is something Newsies did incredibly well. So let's look at exactly how. First, we're going to talk about the movie. Newsies is a 1992 American historical drama produced by Walt Disney Pictures, directed by Kenny Ortega, with a book by Bob Zudiker and Noni White, and it features 12 original songs by Alan Menken with lyrics by Jack Feldman, and stars Christian Bale, Bill Pullman, Anne Margaret, and Robert Duvall. The film is loosely based on the New York City news strike of 1899. It follows 17-year-old Jack Kelly and his fellow newspaper hawkers who sell copies of the New York World on the streets of Manhattan. After publisher Joseph Pulitzer raises the price Newsies must pay for their papers, Jack teams up with new Newsies, David Jacobs and his younger brother Les, with support from reporter Brian Denton of The Sun and vaudeville performer Meta Larkson, to rally the Newsies of New York and go on strike. And that's the basic setup. A lot of the critical response to Newsies can be summarized by a New York Times review by Janet Maslin from April 8th, 1992. Some of Maslin's core points focus on the film's musical execution. She argues that the score provides the movie's only bright spots, but that even these are bungled. She takes particular issue with the staging of many musical numbers, which she describes as being staged so strangely that the characters, when they begin singing, appear to have taken leave of their senses. According to Maslin, the staging of songs like Santa Fe goes well beyond the run-of-the-mill fantasy. She also criticizes Kenny Ortega's handling of musical structure, noting that songs are frequently broken up with dialogue and often cut short before they can build to a satisfying climax. Rather than allowing numbers to grow organically out of the story, the choreography, by Ortega and Peggy Holmes, combines stylistically clashing elements, including period Irish jigs and contemporary hip-hop movement. As Maslin observes, these musical outbursts do not grow organically from the film's other action, and consequently feels forced and inauthentic. Finally, Maslin argues that the film's broader worldview undermines its subject matter. She describes Newsies as offering a fairy tale view of labor relations, adding that it is difficult to imagine a worst moment for film that supposes a dispute between labor and management could be settled by a few songs. Now, at first glance, this reads like a pretty brutally scathing review, but if you look closer, Maslin isn't just saying the movie is bad, she's pointing out a really deep structural problem. The film medium, at least as Newsies uses it, cannot sustain the musical language the story requires. And that's because the movie seems almost addicted to realism. Newsies opens not with spectacle or music, but with a voiceover over historical-looking photographs, positioning itself closer to a documentary than a musical. This commitment to realism is never fully abandoned throughout the movie, even as characters repeatedly break into non-diegetic song and dance. The result is completely tonally inconsistent. Musical moments feel constrained, while realism is completely undermined. In attempting to balance historical authenticity with musical spectacle, the film ultimately weakens both. Some of the strongest adjustments made to Newsies in its adaptation from screen to stage include the strengthening of the collective ensemble voice and the full embrace of musical spectacle. From its opening moments, however, the film adamantly resists both. In 1899, the streets of New York City echoed with the voices of Newsies, peddling the newspapers of Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, and other giants of the newspaper world. On every street corner you saw them, carrying the banner, bringing you the news for a penny a peep. For orphans and runaways, the Newsies were a ragged army, without a leader. Until one day, that all changed. That is the contents of the opening voiceover of the film. Despite gesturing towards a ragged army, the narrative immediately centers Jack Kelly as a Hollywood-style protagonist, an individual through whom the audience is meant to experience the story. And this isn't incidental. Classic Hollywood cinema, as film theorists such as David Bordwell and Kristin Thompson have argued, privileges a single, psychologically motivated protagonist whose goals and decisions drive the plot forward. Even stories about groups are typically filtered through one central figure in order to maintain narrative clarity and audience identification. In Newsies, this character-centered model clashes with the story's fundamentally collective identity. A labor strike is, by nature, a shared action, but in the film, the Newsies function less as an organizing force and more as narrative support, orbiting a single hero rather than operating as a unified body. Musical theater, however, operates according to a different logic. As Scott McMillan explains, musicals redistribute narrative emphasis away from linear plot and psychological realism, allowing meaning to emerge through song, repetition, and collective expression. Collective expression in this case being the powerful ensemble numbers. These, according to him, externalize conflict and ideology, transforming groups, not individuals, into narrative agents. The central failure of the Newsies film, then, is not simply that it is overly realistic or insufficiently spectacular, but in that it attempts to combine two incompatible storytelling systems into one. It adheres to the individual-driven logic of Hollywood cinema, while gesturing towards the collective expressive language of the musical. The Broadway adaptation succeeds precisely because it abandons this compromise. By allowing the ensemble to function as a narrative engine and embracing spectacle rather than suppressing it, the stage version aligns form with content. So, let's talk about some specifics. One of the biggest changes in the stage version is shifting the focus away from Jack Kelly as the story and towards the Newsies as a group. In the film, almost everything runs through Jack. He's the emotional center, the decision maker, and the lens through which we understand the strike. Even when the boys are together, the movie keeps reminding us who the hero is. In the opening number, Carrying the Banner, the Newsies literally chant Jack's nickname, Cowboy, as the song builds. The group exists, but it exists around him. On stage, that hierarchy disappears. And while the musical still centers Jack as a clear protagonist, it gives him other strong characters around him and allows the story to breathe beyond him. Let's take Santa Fe, his big I Want number. The first prologue version in the stage version functions as a conversation between Jack and Crutchy, another young newsie, establishing Crutchy's desires as he joins Jack in imagining a life out west. Lines like, "I bet a few months of clean air and you could toss that crutch for good," explicitly fold Crutchy into the song's emotional core. The prologue also expresses the collective desire of all the Newsies through their shared voice. "We won't let them bastards beat us. We won't beg no one to treat us fair and square." Jack's solo version of Santa Fe also appears later in the story. In the film, it arrives earlier, foregrounding Jack's personal escape before the strike has even fully taken shape. The staging makes some questionable tonal choices, most notably an extended dance sequence that culminates with Jack jumping onto a horse. In a film otherwise committed to realism, this moment feels jarring. Jack then reprises the song while trapped in the refuge, a location that carries really heavy thematic weight, as an embodiment of systemic injustice and the real stakes of exploitation. Whereas in the stage musical, Santa Fe doesn't return until the very end of Act 1 after Crutchy is taken. It still functions as a continuation of Jack's arc. He remains the protagonist and leader, but it no longer pulls the focus away from the strike. Instead, it just deepens his emotional journey without undermining the collective story. Okay, now let's talk ensemble, because if there's one thing the stage version truly excels at, it's the use of the ensemble. Specifically, we're going to talk about Carrying the Banner, Seize the Day, and Once and For All. So, in both versions, Carrying the Banner is undeniably an ensemble number. That's not debatable. But the adjustments made for the stage are immediately evident. Even as the boys sing together in the film, Jack remains the clear center. On stage, however, the boys move as a unit, sing as a unit, and occupy the stage collectively. From the beginning, the number establishes this as a story powered by many voices, not just one. This is especially clear in how the musical introduces the Newsies. Jack fully leaves the stage at the beginning to let them shine, re-entering as a member of the group as opposed to the organizer or focal point. He doesn't hijack the song. In fact, the emphasis falls on the other Newsies who do most of the dancing. Even when the Delancey brothers are introduced, Jack still lands the punch, but instead of turning the moment into a heroic chant of "Get 'em, cowboy," he runs downstage and the action continues behind the rest of the ensemble. Carrying the Banner no longer introduces a hero, it introduces a community. Seize the Day is another huge one of the most iconic songs in the show. In the 1992 film, Seize the Day begins with Davy, but almost immediately snowballs into mass participation. Newsies across the city join in without hesitation, and the camera rapidly cuts from group to group, showing individuals singing but rarely making a visible choice. Even the Scabs abandon Pulitzer with virtually no resistance, spotting Jack, shrugging, and immediately tossing down their papers. The strike feels less like a decision and more like an inevitability, driven by musical momentum rather than persuasion. The stage version slows this moment down. Instead of instant unity, we watch Jack and Davy move through the crowd, speaking directly to other Newsies one by one. Each new voice joins deliberately, and each body added to the choreography signals commitment. This shift is crystallized by a stage-only rally speech in which Jack reframes the strike as a collective moral cause, naming how Pulitzer sees them as disposable, insisting that poverty is not a crime, and extending the stakes beyond the Newsies to all exploited children across the city. That idea later returns at the climax with the Children's Crusade. Let's also talk choreography. The film version of Seize the Day is the unfortunate culprit for the jig breakdance fusion mentioned in Maslin's New York Times review. But Christopher Gattelli, the choreographer for the Broadway production, does something very different. By fully embracing the choreography, the dances become not just exciting to watch, but narratively meaningful. The boys begin with rough and tumble, intentionally childlike movement, with flexed feet and loose limbs, and gradually grow more disciplined and refined. By the end of the show, their movements feature pointed feet, straighter arms, and clenched fists. We quite literally watch them grow into men through movement, and this progression is especially clear in Seize the Day. In the film, however, the choreography remains childlike throughout, and while this could be read as emphasizing the character's youth, it results in a more static ensemble that shows far less growth over the course of the story. The last number I want to talk about is a personal favorite, Once and For All. This song highlights both the strengths of the stage version and the limitations of the film. In the movie, the song is primarily sung by the leads, and once the papers are printed, it continues in the background over a montage of distribution. The characters themselves largely stop singing on screen, and it mostly plays in the background. With a song as lyrically powerful as Once and For All, however, I would argue that playing in the background significantly undercuts its impact. In the stage production, the Newsies remain central throughout. Race helps lead the operation, and papers are passed from hand to hand across the stage, and the song is allowed to build rather than fade out. The number culminates in a striking image of the entire ensemble standing together, singing about how change is coming, once and for all. There is simply so much in the way these songs build that the movie misses because it holds itself back. Numbers can't be too long, dances can't take up too much space, and spectacle is constantly restrained. When the stage version finally gives itself room, through bigger orchestrations, extended choreography, and songs that are allowed to grow and allowed to be long, it reaches its full potential. The redistribution of narrative power doesn't just stop with the ensemble members, though. It extends to the supporting characters themselves. In the film, Davy and Les are newcomers, Crutchy functions as a younger brother figure, Brian Denton observes from the sidelines, and Sarah Jacobs, who does punch a guy in the face, which is pretty cool, ultimately just exists mostly as a love interest for Jack. In the musical, these characters are expanded beyond their relationship to him. Brian Denton and Sarah Jacobs are combined into Catherine Plummer, a more complex character who actively shapes the story. As an inspiring reporter, she pushes Jack, Davy, and others forward and ultimately helps conceive the Children's Crusade. Davy becomes the voice of organization and strategy, guiding the strike away from impulsive rebellion and towards coordinated action. And Crutchy's removal to the refuge is no longer just Jack's loss. It's a rupture felt by the entire group. Taken together, these changes reinforce the musical's central reinterpretation. Power no longer flows outward from one exceptional hero. It emerges through collaboration, through people learning how to organize, sacrifice, and act together. All of these changes, the ensemble focus, the choreography, the supporting characters, add up to one thing. The stage version understands that Newsies isn't a story about a boy standing up to power. It's a story about a group learning how to stand together. The film keeps pulling that story back into a familiar Hollywood shape, one hero, one arc, one perspective, but the stage version lets it be messy, be loud, be collective, and in doing so, is far more honest. And it works for the stage. In an era where Broadway is dominated by adaptations, Newsies shows that reinterpretation succeeds not by preserving familiar stories, but by asking what those stories need in order to speak meaningfully in a new medium. And sometimes, that reinterpretation is exactly what a story needs to reach its full potential.